Welcome to Radical Engagements, and today we're talking about a Substack post from someone I used to follow on Twitter back when I was on X Twitter, and I thought was kind of interesting. Hard to pin on the political spectrum. A guy who went by the moniker Ghost of Christopher Lasch, or Angry Ghost of Christopher Lasch, and he keeps up a Substack called Paroxysms. And this is from April of this year, called The Problem of the New Elite. And I think it's actually a pretty good essay, so we're going to discuss it. Let me share the essay with those of you watching. Those of you listening are just going to have to take my word for it. All right. Elite is one of the most contested words of our current epoch. Yeah, I mean, this is what I'm talking. I totally agree with this initial assertion. It's both crucial to the way we talk about politics today, and yet it's also seen as a right-wing dog whistle because it's kind of vague and everyone defines it differently. I mean, the PMC is basically a slightly more refined way to talk about the elites, although even that it doesn't end up being that refined, as I've said many times before. So let's go into this. A keyword, as William Williams defined it, is a piece of vocabulary that, due to its complex history of southern shifts of meaning over time, raises problems and difficulties every time it is used. If you want to hear me talk about this in context about liberal and conservative words that become problematic like this, from about 5-6 years ago, you can find something called Keywords on the Sectarian Review, where I talk about things like woke and cultural misappropriation and stuff like that. Words that have been problematically defined and shifting in meaning over time in ways that are hard to deal with. And I definitely agree with Ghost of Lasch here that this is definitely the case with elite. A keyword can have positive associations or transparently obvious meaning for one group of language users, while simultaneously hears in it a cliche, a muddled abstract. Well, I skipped some words there. Let me retry that. A keyword can have positive associations or transparent obvious meanings for one group of language users, while others simultaneously hear in it a cliche, a muddled abstraction, a threat, or an insult. This is why elite is a dog whistle, depending on who says it. This is why I'm talking. Williams' own definition of elite in keywords demonstrates the scope of the problem. Like many keywords, elite contains a number of simultaneous meanings and associations piled up on top of each other, each deriving from a different point in history. Its modern meaning reflects a breakdown of traditional forms of political authority in the 19th century. The word elite becomes synonymous with old forms of political power, which by then had started to totter, their sources of authority unclear and increasingly contested. Negative meanings began to shadow or crowd out positive associations. As a result, to be an elite is now not simply to be eminent or in charge or the best. It is also and simultaneously to be out of touch, outmoded elitist, are subject to inevitable replacement by new aspirant elites coming up from below, aka elite over production thesis via Peter Turchin. When in his new book, Values, Voices, and Virtue, Matthew Goodwin writes that, quote, people who really run Britain and many other Western democracies today, unquote, are members of a, quote, a new middle-class graduate elite, unquote. Sounds like PMC thesis to me. Although a little bit more specific, actually, middle class and graduate elite, and middle class here in the British context meaning something different, meaning bourgeois, as opposed to like middle income strata, which is what it means in America. That represents, quote, no more than 1/4 of the nation, then he is not merely stating facts. He is mobilizing and appealing to a range of associations, beliefs, and media memories in the minds of his readers, each summoned into the foreground by the incantation of a single key word, elite. In fact, Godwin performs this incantation often in Values, Voice, and Virtue. The word elite appears no more no fewer than 533 times in the book. Damn. For some reason, the word will perhaps evoke respectable memories of previous works of social cultural critique, such as the early pages of Christopher Lasch's Revolt of the Elites, with their portraits of professional managerial elites becoming increasingly detached from the lives and concerns of their less privileged compatriots. For others, however, like the Sun readers who are informed by Goodwin, that quote, the new elite demands things signal their status to other elites, such as open borders, as relaxed approach to dealing with small boats, or the sexualization of children, which will not have to suffer the effects themselves. Godwin clearly writes for Spiked and some quasi-conservative in denial outlet. This is neither here nor there. The word elite may have another set of connotations entirely. As Sam Elliott Stranger remarks of the word dude in the opening scene of Big Lebowski, this is a moniker that no one would self-apply where he comes from. Yeah, this is why I talk about elites and PMC thesis often being PMC and PMC violence, because it's a lot of people who talk about it are clearly talking about a class of which they are a strata of the class, really, of which they belong, but of which they do not want to belong. And so the PMC is always everybody else, even if you are clearly part of it. Quote, the back and forth between Godwin and his critics over the applicability of the term new elite represents a real discursive impasse. This amounts to more than the fact that when a car is clearly going in the wrong direction, as most people, regardless of their personal politics, seem to believe in the British state currently is, asterisk, of course it is, the British state is drowning. No one wants to admit to being in the driver's seat. Yeah, the PMC, the elite, is always everyone but you. And I've actually pointed out when people like, oh, people can't think of this, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, but aren't you part of the educated middle class strata that you're calling the PMC? And aren't you raising a denial about it? And so, no, the PMC is not stopping you for thinking that because you are part of their class and you think that. Sorry. You're not special. The term itself, elite, has become tainted and unproductive. In the tussle over the terminology which has resulted, the writer issue that Godwin's argument initially seemed to have raised has effectively disappeared. What should have been the targets of Godwin's critique can easily evade it by focusing on their responses and its rhetorical shortcuts and exaggerations. Asterisk. Yeah, Godwin's an interesting example because you could easily talk about this with David Brooks or a whole number of liberal elite criticisms that even began in the 1990s in America, which had the same tone and the same vagueness. A lot of that actually came out of kind of post Frankfurt School theory that you saw it like Helios, and you saw it from both centrist conservatives like David Brooks, but also people like paleoconservative Paul Godfrey. And Godwin seems to echo them both weirdly. Goodwin, excuse me. Keep on wanting to make him Godwin. And I think it's because I've been reading a lot about Mary Shelley lately. I have weird habits. Back to the text. What should have been the targets of Goodwin's critique can easily evade it by focusing their responses the new elite that really runs Britain today. Worse, as Thomas Poisner points out, this simplistic framing enables them to dismiss the analysis criticism of this social cultural class as right-wing scaremongering. Yeah, although sometimes it is right-wing scaremongering. Values, voice, and virtue simply doesn't represent the new elite in terms it would self-recognize. Taking it as an undivided overclass that has very C. Wright Mills, but also Michael Lind overtones. Goodwin overlooks the large inequities in both generational and professional clout within the occupations grouped under the new elite heading. Asterisk. I've been complaining about this when people talk about the PMC thesis too, on asterisk. He also disregards considerable economic stress suffered by both institutions and individuals under the austerity and in the long fallout from the global financial crisis of 2008. The fact that members of so many of these professions within Goodwin's new elite, from academics to teachers, baristas, journalists, civil servants, and junior doctors, are currently taking industrial actions indicates that that many are profoundly unsatisfied with the basic pay and conditions. I'm just gonna say that Ghost of Lasch here is actually very acerbic, and Christopher Parenti is one of the only people who's talked about both the PMC and that most of the PMC has moved from a kind of professional bourgeoisie to a professional labor aristocracy with it that has been proletarianized, and this has actually led to all kinds of chaos. But since these people have skills that the state needs, that Christian Parenti argues that while they're proletarians, they don't truly see their interest in the proletarians because they can put pressure on the state. I think that's kind of true. Chris Parenti is not wrong about that. Those on the fixed term of part-time contracts in junior grades and at lower salary levels in particular are highly exposed to the cost of living crisis as well as longer-term sources of economic stress such as rising rents, housing prices and interest rates, student debt, and chronic overproduction of credentials under the current marketized model of higher education. Asterisk, although we are beginning to slightly less overproduce credentialed people, but we'll see how long that lasts. That's just what I'm talking about from the standpoint now. Back to the essay. Many also feel profound disrespected and overlooked by the central government that appears to be in perpetual cost-cutting mode and has declared that it has had enough of experts. Yeah, that's the Tories. Also, you see this in the paranoia on and GOP terms about the deep state. Although, yes, Virginia, there is a deep state. It's not just a conspiracy. It is both a conspiracy and a reality. But the conspiracy and the reality aren't talking about the same things. Back to the text. We need another set of critical lenses for examining the problems of the professional managerial culture and administrative power, one that takes into account the alienation as well as the sense of powerlessness, precarity, and moral emergency that are key components within an effective culture of the contemporary new class. Yeah, so for Ghost of Christopher Lasch here is actually and somewhat correct in noticing this. Barbara and John Ehrenreich both talked about this. Gabriel Winant, from a very left-wing perspective, has talked about this. Anyway, in a follow-up blog post and podcast interviews, Goodwin has acknowledged that his, quote, argument builds upon the works of Christopher Lasch, everybody claims Lasch, Daniel Bell, David Brooks, Richard Florida, Michael Lynn, Sir Roger Scruton, and David Goodhart, amongst others. I would say Christopher Lasch did a whole lot to distance himself from Daniel Bell, and it seems like other than Lind, whose politics are center-right corporatist, most of these people are just box standard conservatives. And they wouldn't all like each other or recognize each other. However, it is another late 20th century critic who perhaps produced the most penetrating and prescient critique of the new class concepts that Goodwin bases his new elite on. In his 1979 book, The Future of Intellectuals and the Rise of the New Class, the renegade Marxist scholar Alvin Gouldner comes up a lot, and he's kind of good. There's a reason why I've been talking about him. Back to text. Set out 16 theses outlining the history and motivations of the new class, as well as the internal characteristics that led to its rise and success. And focusing only on the intellectuals, those involved in the cultural production, such as academics, advertising executives, arts professionals, and journalists, and the technical intellectuals, such as research and computer sciences, managers, administrators, civil servants, bureaucrats, architects, and planners, Gouldner was the most narrowly defined of the new class theories developed during the 1970s. Yeah, he was. I would say that Lasch also had a similar divisions, but he got blurrier in the 80s. Anyway, unlike Goodwin, Gouldner does not imply that members of his new class were actually the ones in charge of things. Bing, bing, bing. Bourgeoisie are still kind of funding everything. However, he suggests the new class had built-in features and advantages that would enable them to compete for those positions in the future. An asterisk, I would say Gouldner actually thought this was a good thing. Gouldner, like Barbara Ehrenreich in the 70s, thought that his new class, like Barbara Ehrenreich, thought the PMC had a potential to be radicalized as part of a revolutionary subject if it could align itself with the working class, which it didn't do. All right. Even though objectively now it is more of a part of a working class than it was in the 1970s. It's an irony that I think only Christian Parenti has really said much about. Anyway, back to the text. What members of Gouldner's new class do essentially is offer their unique expertise in exchange for salaries in government, business, and institutions. Yes, although they used to be petty bourgeois, but so much of society has been petty bourgeois now that it doesn't really matter. They are technicians of systems, symbols, and language that make the administrative infrastructure of capitalism possible, although capitalists resent their reliance on them, and the new class itself often holds capital in contempt. Yep. Patrons and elite servitors often hate each other. Just remember that. That's why I'm talking. Back to the text. Adept at positioning themselves as gatekeepers and conduits, members of the new class identify as guardians and protectors of the working classes and the marginalized. Actually, probably more the marginalized than even the working classes, let's be honest. There's a reason why the upper middle class really likes talking about homeless people and criminals and kind of doesn't talk about the working class that much, except sort of sometimes, and only in specific subsets that it feels like it's morally obligated to because it reflects its moral sense of oblige or moral justification. By the way, I think historically, even before capitalist systems, and this is where I'm still talking, that noblesse oblige as a moral justification usually comes out as systems are actually dying. So you see the moral code of chivalry being valorized versus the actual political motivation of chivalry in the late medieval period because chivalry is already dying as a competency set. I want you to think about that trend. I don't think that's unique to capitalism at all. Never adept at positioning themselves as gatekeepers. Oh, we already talked about this. Nevertheless, Gouldner is clear that the new class has its own class interest in mind at all times. The radical left politics professed by many of its members might manifest as passionate rallying cry against inequity. However, the Gouldner theory holds socialism is a natural ideology of the new class, not because it would provide social justice for the working classes, but simply because it eliminates the capitalists and places the intellectuals in complete command, aka what I sometimes call the Adornoization of society. Short of an actual revolution, new class penetration into people's lives and workplaces has a similarly controlling and suffocating quality. The quote, new professionals of the new class latch on to human emotions and relationships, positioning themselves as saviors, therapists, and social activists, aka they manipulate the perception of kinship bonds, but don't actually build kinship bonds. That's Derek talking. They are adept at identifying new social emergencies in the workplace institutions and championing policies and bureaucracies to address and abolish them, staffed nationally by new cadres of circling new class employees. This is funny because in a lot of ways this is just, and I don't know that Gouldner actually knew this, but this is basically Robert Michel. And Robert Michel just thinks this always happens. And while I think that there's research on how you can prevent this from happening and there is a way to do it, the way is narrow and you have to really build it. There is, as sociologist David Ashley writes, a kind of built-in imperialism to this line of work. New layers of administration and workplace surveillance proliferate. These workplace initiatives, moreover, focus more minutely on terrain used to be regarded as personal and off-limits, exposing employees' conducts, beliefs, and inner lives to increasing layers of moral scrutiny. The moral causes championed by the new class, such as diversity and inclusion, as well as the social harms they champion against, such as hate and the climate emergency, those aren't the same things, buddy. Like at all. Anyway, are often vaguely defined and open-ended. The climate emergency is not really vaguely defined and can be endlessly reinvented to allow bureaucratic expansion. This is true, even in climate change. Are future initiatives to be put in its place? Members of the new class ultimately derive their authority, Gouldner argues, from modes of speech and argument. Specifically, what he defines as their deployment of cultural critical discourse, or CCD. CCD is a mode of speaking and writing in which speakers must justify all assertions they make, but by deploying evidence or reason forms of argument, and not by simply referring to tradition or relying on personal authority. Yeah, I don't agree with Gouldner. This is new. Good speech is speech that can make its own principles explicit and is oriented towards conforming with them rather than stressing context sensitivity and context variability. Good speech here thus has theoreticity. Yeah, but that's different than arguing by rationality. Ghost of Lasch, you shouldn't actually equate those two things. I've read two Gouldner books, and I don't think he actually does that. Anyway, the triumph of CCD, as Gouldner suggests, was part and parcel of capitalism's successful assault on traditional religiously grounded understanding of knowledge. Yeah, I think that's true. Actually, Gouldner here is just picking up from Weber, in the rationalization and the instrumental rationalization of society. Adorno also talks about this. This is not unique to Gouldner, or it's kind of actually assumed in a lot of modern sociology post the German historical school. Anyway, back to the text. What CCT does is to disqualify all speech grounded on traditional social authority, which authorizes itself as the standard of all serious speech. Basically, it says you have to actually prove stuff, but its way of proving stuff is geared towards the verbal more than the competent. It's verbal competent more than rational competence, I think. Anyway, back to Ghost of Lasch. CCD has several consequences for those who use it. First, it necessitates a pose of impersonality, much like the journalistic voice from nowhere. It seems to rise above the individual speaker and resist embodiment in any particular person or point of view. Yeah, it is a theoretically ubiquitous vocabulary. That's why I'm talking about the text. This is a discursive realm of trusting the science, or the figures speak for themselves. I think Ghost of Lasch is actually mixing liberal moralization of competency discourse with Gouldner's talk about this, which is more about the beginnings of sociological and moral justifications of what we would call back in the 90s and aughts post-modernity. I don't think they're actually the same thing, but I do think they have a similar function in that they mystify the ability of people to look at the facts and figures themselves and tell people to trust the experts without really justifying how expertise is really defined or made valid. So you can't actually look at someone and say, well, should I trust this person? Should I trust even this discipline's consensus? It may result in a form of technical jargon or rhetoric that is highly distinctive in itself, but which curiously renders all users of it seamlessly indistinguishable from one another. Bing, 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 bing. This is actually true. But this is to me not true about the trust of science and figures speak for themselves discourse. I don't know why he's conflating that. Because this stuff is vague in a way that everybody can think they can do it. I mean, think about Ben Shapiro, my facts over your feelings. Well, that's actually just the conservative version of that, of the liberal, reality driven community argument from the aughts. Whereas the technical or rhetorical jargon stuff, such as like standpoint, diversity, and all that's actually from something completely different. Secondly, encourages a sense of detachment from all local levels. CCD is above all international and cosmopolitan in scope. It's both transnational language shared by a new class adherents across national borders. Yes. This is a critique that I had of the Ghost of Lasch, and that is like that he thinks national borders are more substantially real than I do. Its modes of speech and self-understanding encourage members to distance themselves from particular history-bound places. Yes, but nations are not particularly history-bound places. They're places that artificially and synthetically construct a unified history that often is not really there. Our languages are folk understandings of families and local cultures. Well, if nations were just the organic results of languages, they wouldn't have to have language standardization and stamping out of dialects as part of the entire modus operandi of nation building, now would they? Yeah. I've agreed with this so far, but this is where I think there's some assumptions being snuck in, some rather conservative ones. Similarly, it encourages a global or unified view of problems that lend itself easily to an affinity with a deep green ecological systems-based understanding of the world. You're going to have to try harder than that. Deep green ecological systems-based understanding of the world. You can't equate these three things. These are actually not easily equatable. Nor is this actually equal to cosmopolitanism. This is just a way to argue for conservatism without actually owning it. Sorry, man. The cosmopolitan and free-floating nature of CCDs contributes to another characteristic of new class identity, alienation. That's not unique to the new class, my fucking friend. It fosters a deeply radicalizing critical orientation to both knowledge and politics. Yeah, capitalism does that. Go back and read Marx, my friend. Don't just read Lasch. I say this as a Lasch scholar. All truth's claims, no matter how authoritative, fall under the remit and scrutiny of the CCD and its community of speech users. This, at least initially, has a profound leveling effect. The highest office holder and the lowest member of the CCD community are reduced to the same horizontal plane of argument, are bound by the same rules of discourse and evidence. They're not really bound by the same discourse and evidence. They're bound by the same rules of discourse. They're not bound by the same rules of evidence. I don't believe that. Anyway, I don't believe that's true at all. However, the CCD's box of critical tools can give issues their sense of innate superiority over the objects of their critique. This I agree with. Quote, and this is a long quote from Gouldner, CCD treats the relationship between those who speak it and others about whom they speak as a relationship between judges and the judged. Absolutely. But it implies that the established social hierarchy is only a semblance and that a deeper, more important distinction is between those who speak and understand truly and those who do not. To participate in the culture of critical discourse, then, is to be emancipated at once from lowness in the conventional social hierarchy, and this is thus a subversion of that hierarchy. To participate in the culture of critical discourse, then, is a political act. The gulf, and this is now back to Ghost of Lasch, the gulf between the intoxicating temporary power reversals that CCD can seem to confer, and often precarious material circumstances the average CCD user, however, produces its own form of alienation. Yeah, because they exist in capitalism, bro. Like, you're still actually removed from even your intellectual commodity discourse because intellectual rents are not something that you own, even if they're your ideas. All right. Members of the new class can end up feeling perpetually cheated and frustrated, as though their rewards and powers they feel entitled to are constantly slipping out of their reach. How is this different really from everybody but the bourgeois and proletarians? Classical Marxism, dude. Anyway, back to the text. Doubling down on rhetoric becomes its own form of denial, a way of disavowing knowledge that wielding symbols and devastating opponents with language have a habit of never actually achieving any real world effects. Absolutely. And what I find interesting is you don't just see this in liberal discourses, you also see it in conservative ones. A lot of the conservative mongering about words, like they're recapturing a woke and critical race theory, do the same kind of mystifying that this does in other places. This is a frustration is magnified by the chronic global overproduction of symbolic analysts and PhD holders by universities. Yes, they have to, because if you don't overproduce, you can't maintain your program. The program has to grow to try to water. This was a phenomenon first visible in the United States in the 60s and 70s, absolutely. However, the global collapse of the academic job market, particularly in the humanities after the financial collapse of 2008, has dwarfed any previous manifestation of this problem. Also true. Completely agree with you here, Ghost of Lasch. As devastating as this is for the often debt-burdened and precariously employed junior members of the academic faction within the new class, alienation, particularly like adjuncts who are, like, in terms of wealth distribution and in terms of power, less than like even most fucking blue collar workers. Alienation and elite overproduction produce their own powerful feedback mechanisms. Institutions use the oversupply of credentialed labor to drive down wages and conditions, basically proletarianizing the PMC, which is not something anyone wants to hear who makes PMC critiques. Getting critique on the cheap, until they get rid of humanities altogether, which is what they're doing. Frustrated expectations, meanwhile, inflame existing radical tendencies within a new class. Rhetoric becomes divorced even further from reality, and fetishes are consistent on the transformative powers of language. This I agree with Ghost of Lasch on entirely. The focus on the transformative powers of language and the way we express social hierarchy as if it is what drives changes in social hierarchy, as if it's not just a reflection of it, or even in a complicated feedback loop with it, is where a lot of this goes wrong, which is why you get on a euphemism treadmill. Like, you can change the words, but the prior words that you use that you've replaced with something better are now themselves offensive because you didn't actually change the condition, so the offense is still there. Anyway, a deeply felt sense of the new class being oppressed victims themselves, meanwhile, reinvigorates the central mystification within the new class understanding of itself, that it exists to liberate oppressed groups and avenge victims everywhere, rather than simply to further its own class interest. And I think this is fair enough. Although I would say that this is also cynically used by conservative members of this same class to pretend that everybody is just as cynical as they are. Just going to say that. But I think this is still more or less true. Into this, in the aftermath of the 2008 global financial crisis, capitalism faced a huge legitimacy crisis. Yep, that's why Marxism came back. It didn't do anything, but it came back in a way that Gouldner would have predicted. During the ensuing years of fiscal austerity, the crisis ramified in all directions as cutbacks, underfunding, and shrinking markets compromised missions of both publicly and privately funded institutions everywhere. Some of them just collapsed. This is why I'm talking. Back to the text. The old narratives of improvement and uplift, which these institutions relied on to carry out their business, came to be unsustainable. For many younger members of the new class, especially, an overwhelming sense of blockage, overproduction, and injustice, as well as pervasive existential anxiety, had become to shape their dominant emotional repertoires. I'm going to say this, though. Gouldner thinks this is where Marxism comes from in the 19th century. It is not just for Gouldner or something that was new to the 70s, but you have to read two of his books, not one of his books, to get that. Back to this. However, despite the new class's traditional sense of its own powerlessness, these conditions and preoccupations have not been simply ignored. Okay, now we see the equation of all the things liberal as one thing, but not with all things conservatives. Suspicious that. In response to the environmental activism and race and gender-based social justice movements of the early mid-20 teens, both the institution and capitalism itself have come to decisively embrace the language of environmental sustainability and anti-discrimination. Yes, green and blackwashing. With the burgeoning growth of the DEI, EDI industries globally, this was in April. We're already in November, and we've seen this dramatically subtract in a year. So I can't say that this has been exploding globally still. It was already beginning to take a turn when this was written. Many hundreds of thousands of new class job opportunities have opened up and closed up already. All right. These industries have significantly reshaped the contours of the post-2008 organization. Yes. But they were probably a bigger deal before they were really noticed. Like, I remember when Sui Park did the whole cancel Colbert thing, and one of the things she bragged about is that she gave up $1,000 $1,000 to $4,000 a week paycheck doing diversity trainings to start the cancel Colbert thing, and then she ended up a church lady. Anyway, back to the text. That was in 2013, 14. New internal markets and administrative structures and forms of auditing have been imposed on both businesses and public institutions, reflecting the accelerated corporate concern and awareness, the concern to communicate the concerns and awareness with issues of inclusivity, underrepresentation, and climate emergency. I want to say here, this is what's actually the big important, and concerns to communicate concerns and awareness, which is a bigger deal than actually doing anything about them. Although the discourses of workplace activism and institutional and corporate responsibility are by no means new, no, they go back to the 19th century, absolutely correct. These concerns have lately attained a degree of cultural centrality they had not since the new radicalism of the 1970s. I would more or less agree with that, and they're also collapsing just as fast. In some ways, I feel like this is old news already. Back to the text. I mean, this was in April, but still. In fact, we could see a new corporate sustainability and equality agenda to this, representing a new compact between the new class and capital, a phenomenon akin to welfare state compromise of the post-Second War period, albeit one focused heavily on the politics of symbolic recognition, rather than the redistribution of wealth or material goods. I would say that you could see that, but you don't actually see that because people don't eat symbols. But it has led to the current emotivism. I would agree with Gouldner and Lasch on this. As then, the compact provides benefits for both sides, though in practice, only a subsection of the new class itself directly benefits, a very small subsection. Sustainability, diversity, inclusion open up vast new terrains of new class professional intervention. That's true. That's true for all this stuff. All this stuff is managed bureaucracy. All underwritten by new forms of auditing, metrization, and managerial discourse production, at which the new class excels. Yes, although they can't actually fix the climate problems. That's the funny thing. Like, they can measure it, they can talk about it and freak people out about it, but they can't. Their ways of handling it, cap and trade, carbonization schemes, etc., don't actually fix the problem at all. These new ethically charged career pathways thus follow the pattern of expertise brokerage, which via the market and institutional recognition that the new class has traditionally relied on for its existence. Yes. Those who hold out the promise of emotionally satisfying work for professionals who would prefer to regard their labor in moral rather than material terms. This is why so many people go into nonprofits, as if that's somehow better. For business and institutions, meanwhile, colluding with a new class provides an access to new human resources. Actually, it also just provides access to new markets. Come on, man. The CDC informed critical energies and moral frustrations of the young idealist new class employee, whose alienation and sense of generation and justice can be put to productive use in the internal forms of organizational creative destruction. Yeah, that's true. The anti policies encouraged by sustainability and social harm agendas provide ample scope for new forms of surveillance, internal discipline, and other kinds of workplace continuous improvements. Yeah, it does allow for more intervention in people's private lives. I think that's a true and fair thing to say. Material critiques and existential concerns can thus be framed as moral issues and reified as new comms and bureaucratic procedures, the creation of which is often palmed off on starry-eyed young graduates eager to, quote, make a difference and see their institutions, quote, centering the marginalized. The metrics and audit trails resulting from the implementation of new anti-policies enable businesses and institutions to claim that they are addressing issues, listening to concerns, and generally bending the arc of history and dialogue would concern stakeholders. Yeah, that's all moral discourse stuff. Totally still agree with I agree with Ghost of Lash there. The intensive motivism, absolutely. Read Lester McIntyre, an evangelical tone of these claims can generate, as well as the new ethical and moral workplace surveillance cultures they encourage, may produce their own forms of alienation among staff who refuse to drink the Kool-Aid, resulting in the production of dissent or heterodox professional managerial class fractions. Yes, PMC on PMC violence is a product of this. So you guys who think you get out of this are still engaged in it. Indeed, much of the heterodox IDW, or what used to be called post-left Twitter, yeah, we don't call it post-left anymore because a lot of them just became right-wingers. And also, it's the third iteration of post-web. And intellectual dark web and post-left Twitter actually largely, IDW actually largely predates that, but whatever, could be interpreted as a jaded and skeptical members of the PMC mouthing off with their various degrees of autonomy about the new ideological curriculum in their workplace and attempting to develop their own collective explanations for what has been happening. You know what? I'm going to give Ghost of Lash credit because I've been saying this for a long time. That's what I mean by PMC and PMC violence culture. However, a purely cynical interpretation of the new compact would be simplistic and reductive. Absolutely. Large business truly do want to connect with new markets. Thank you, finally. And foster a sense of intense identification amongst their employees. Correct. Because it makes them easier to control if they buy in. When stemming from workers having evolved ideals, worldviews, and identities recognized by their employers. Yeah, it's cheaper than actually providing material benefits. You ask public schools how they get people to survive off of a sense of moral righteousness. A sense of leading on sustainability, inclusion, and well-being, meanwhile, appeals to the messianic strains of corporate leadership culture and all parts of our culture, actually, as well as opening up new forms of competition, corporate value, and benchmarking. Yep, it's a form of creative destruction and rentier seeking. The compact fosters a degree of buy-in at all levels. This is why the right's complacent and demonstrating accurate phase, go work, go bloke, is so conceived. The absorption of the new crass critique and idealism by business and institution does not represent any kind of spanner in the works. Instead, it is a, so far, highly successful response. It did start not being successful in the middle of this year, to a legitimacy crisis. Yeah, it's still that, though. One that ultimately reinforces critical energies to predict new products and services, new market mechanisms, new rounds of organizational reforms. As much as I have been slightly annoyed with parts of this and consider it to have some undercurrents of conservatism, this is one of the smarter versions of this critique. I want to give Ghost of Lash that credit. Anyway, we got one paragraph left. As the awareness of the compact reveals both sides of the current debate in Britain, yeah, I don't care about Britain. I mean, I do. I feel bad for it, but it's. I think we have to be careful using Britain as a paradigm for the elite because it's declining even relative to Europe and much definitely relative to the United States. And the United States is declining, so. Over the existence otherwise of a new our leader tilting at straw men. New class under the emerging compact is neither really ruling the nation, nor is it powerless and put upon victims of circumstances beyond its control. Bing! This is true. Right? This strata, and I'm going to refer to it as a strata, I don't think is actually a class. It doesn't have a clear productive capacity or a clear relationship to control, but there are allied interest in it. I think this is actually really correct. Instead of capital and entrepreneurial elements within the new class were working together in the furtherance of their own material and professional interests. I think that's true. This challenge for both capital and new classes going forward is how long can these critical energies be contained and redirected if meaningful change proves to be impossible to deliver? Yeah, and I would say from the standpoint of November as opposed to April of the same year, it looks like we're already beginning to run out of steam on this. Particularly if you look at how progressivism has become increasingly less and less popular, even though people are still dislike Trump as much as they did before. I mean, generic moderate Democrat, you know, dominates the ballot as long as you're not actually putting your face to that generic, abstract, dominant Democrat. No one actually likes any of our actual elites. How far can this new compact be pushed before it reaches its external as well as internal limits? I would say we're already seeing not very far. Like many things, this is kind of post left or something. I don't know what the call goes to Lasch. He was one of these guys on Twitter that I liked following because I agree. When he was on fire, I thought he was definitely on fire. But other times, I'm like, well, that just sounds like conservatism, bro. I mean, he probably thinks the same about me and my antinomian leftism is somehow just liberalism or nihilism. I get that a lot too. I don't think it's either, but what are you going to do? Anyway, read this essay, engage with it. You don't have to agree with it. And in fact, it's not all Ghost of Lasch's ideas. Some of my problems actually go back to Gouldner, but the way we're applying Gouldner to post 2020 discourse. I would say one of the things I would point out, though, is like, yes, a lot of this is new left, but some of this stuff about language policing was very in vogue to both do and complain about in the 1990s systematic left, and it became very unpopular and probably drove a lot of people to being apolitical over time. And I remember tons of people who were just 5-10 years older than me both being very concerned about the way people spoke, but also very concerned that this was politically correctness gone awry, and that the right wanting to enforce political correctness during post 9/11 actually stopped that discourse for about 10 years, and it came back as right wingers and conservatives picking up on intra left polemics about cancel culture, call out culture first, then cancel culture, which those began as inter left debates, right? And then about wokeness, and now that word means something completely different than even when I commented on it as a key word 5 years ago. All these things are flashpoints and flashpoint abstractions that are contested. So, and I think that element of Ghost of Lasch's critique is also pretty apt. Read this article. You don't have to agree with it, but I would engage it. I think despite some things that I read as kind of lingeringly conservative, this is pretty insightful about the dynamics of what's going on, what we talk about when we talk about elites. For those of you who don't get that half my puns are like Shakespeare or Raymond Carver jokes, this is so you know where I get it from. I've trained in MFA, and sometimes I'm giving to mocking the slightly above midwit criterion of that world. Anyway, let that be a lesson to me about my own battling humanitarian elitism, fighting my own working class origins or some shit. All right. Anyway, like and subscribe, hit the bell, share, comment, engage with this, engage with the actual post too, and I'll have the link in the show notes. Check you later.